Long before the rise of the powerful Axumite Empire and centuries before the name Ethiopia would appear in historical records, the highlands of northern Ethiopia and present-day Eritrea were home to one of Africa's earliest complex societies. This ancient kingdom was known as Demt, a little-known but foundational civilization that laid the groundwork for later Imperial Ethiopia. The kingdom of Demti emerged around the 10th century BCE in the region now covering parts of Eritrea and northern Ethiopia. Its heartland was centered in the plateau region near modern-day Yeha in Tigray. What makes Demt significant is not only its early date, placing it among the first organized states in sub-Saharan Africa, but also its role as a cultural and technological bridge between the African highlands and the southern Arabian peninsula. Archaeological evidence, especially the remains of temples, inscriptions, and administrative buildings at Yeha, reveals a society that was already sophisticated by the early 1st millennium BCE. The massive temple at Yeha, built in a distinct South Arabian style using finely cut stone blocks, is considered the oldest standing structure in Ethiopia. Its construction reflects both skilled labor and a degree of political organization. More importantly, it suggests connections with the Sabaean kingdom in southern Arabia, located across the Red Sea in modern-day Yemen. The presence of Sabaean inscriptions and architectural styles led early scholars to believe that Demt was a colony of Sabaeans. However, more recent scholarship has challenged this view. While there was clearly contact, perhaps through trade or the movement of artisans and religious elites, there is no strong evidence that Demt was politically subordinate to Saba. Instead, it seems to have been a local African polity that absorbed cultural influences from across the Red Sea and adapted them into its own context. This blending of African and South Arabian elements is one of the defining features of Demti. The kingdom used the Sabaean script and language for inscriptions, but it also began developing what would later become the Ge'ez script, the basis of the liturgical language of Ethiopian Christianity. The use of writing and monumental architecture reflects a level of state formation that was rare in sub-Saharan Africa at the time. Economically, DMT was likely based on agriculture, particularly the cultivation of cereals and livestock herding in the fertile Ethiopian highlands, but trade played a crucial role as well. Its proximity to the Red Sea coast enabled contact with Arabian, and perhaps even Egyptian and Mediterranean, trading networks. Goods such as incense, gold, ivory, and exotic animals may have passed through the region, making Demt part of a wider system of commerce. The rulers of Demt remain mostly anonymous to us today. Inscriptions mention a figure named Mukareb of Demt, though his precise role, whether a king, priest, or local governor, is unclear. The lack of detailed records limits what can be said about Demt's political system, but the scale of its architecture suggests the existence of a centralized authority, likely a king supported by a religious or priestly class. As the memory of Demt faded from the political landscape of the northern Horn of Africa, new centers of power began to emerge across the highlands. These small kingdoms and chiefdoms, inheritors of Demt's agricultural, religious, and administrative traditions, laid the foundation for what would become one of the most powerful and influential African empires of antiquity. The kingdom of Axum, centered in what is today northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, began to assert itself as a dominant regional power around the 1st century BCE. It developed from one of the many smaller polities that had succeeded Demt. The city of Aksum, from which the kingdom took its name, became the political and spiritual heart of this new state. Positioned strategically near the Red Sea and surrounded by fertile highland terrain, Aksum quickly grew in both strength and ambition. One of the critical reasons for Aksum's rise was its control of trade routes. Aksum's geographic location offered it access to both the African interior and the coastal ports of the Red Sea, particularly the port of Adulis. This port, located near modern-day Massawa in Eritrea, became a bustling hub of commerce linking Aksum to trade networks that stretched to the Mediterranean, the Arabian Peninsula, India, and beyond. Goods such as ivory, gold, frankincense, animal skins, and exotic animals flowed through Axumite markets, while imported luxuries included textiles, metal goods, wine, and spices. This trade not only brought wealth, but also international visibility. Aksum appears in the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a Greek merchant's guide written in the 1st century CE, which describes it as a powerful kingdom ruled by a king named Zoskales. Although little else is known about Zoskales, his mention in this text confirms that Aksum had already established itself as a recognized power within the global trading world. Economically, Aksum's wealth allowed it to pursue monumental construction projects and develop state institutions. One of the clearest signs of this newfound state power is the erection of massive stone stelae, tall, decorated obelisks carved from single pieces of granite. These stelae, found mostly in the city of Aksum, served as markers for underground tombs and were likely intended to demonstrate royal authority and religious significance. The tallest standing stela today rises over 70 feet, and ancient accounts suggest that even taller ones once stood. The Axumite elite also began minting their own coinage, a rare practice in ancient sub-Saharan Africa. The earliest coins were minted during the reign of King Endubis in the late 3rd century CE. These coins bore inscriptions in Greek, the language of international commerce at the time, and served both as currency and propaganda. The images and inscriptions projected the authority of the king while facilitating trade across regions where coinage was expected. Aksum's state apparatus was highly centralized. Power was concentrated in the hands of the king, known by the title Negus or Negusa Nagast, meaning King of Kings. While the names and dates of early rulers are not well preserved, inscriptions and foreign sources point to a lineage of powerful monarchs who governed with both military strength and religious authority. Axumite kings commanded armies that expanded the kingdom's borders and subdued rival peoples. Aksum's expansion into surrounding territories was gradual but decisive. To the west and south, it extended influence into the Ethiopian highlands, incorporating diverse ethnic groups under its rule. To the northeast, it reached across the Red Sea into parts of the Arabian Peninsula. The control of key trade routes in these regions allowed Aksum to compete with neighboring powers, such as the Himyarite kingdom in southern Arabia. The military campaigns undertaken by early Axumite kings are not extensively recorded in surviving sources, but inscriptions found in Ge'ez, the classical Ethiopian script and language, provide glimpses into their conquests. These texts mention battles fought against various peoples such as the Beja and the Agwezat, highlighting the kingdom's expansionist policies and the challenges it faced in maintaining dominance across a wide area. Religion during the early Axumite period was polytheistic and heavily influenced by South Arabian deities. Temples were constructed in honor of gods such as Almaka and Mahrem. Mahrem, in particular, came to be associated with the Axumite kings and was considered a warrior god, a divine protector of the monarchy. This religious association between king and god helped legitimize royal power and justify military expansion. The use of Ge'ez script and language, developed from the South Arabian script, became more standardized during this period. It was used in monumental inscriptions, administration, and eventually religious texts. Over time, Ge'ez evolved into the literary and liturgical language of Ethiopia, surviving today in Ethiopian Orthodox Christian traditions. One of the subtle but significant developments during this early period was Aksum's growing independence from Arabian cultural models. While early Axumite religion and script were influenced by South Arabia, by the 3rd century CE, the kingdom had begun to assert a more distinct African identity. The shift from Sabaean-style temples to uniquely Axumite forms of architecture, the growing use of indigenous names, and the adaptation of writing styles all reflected a society that was forging its own path. By the early 4th century CE, the kingdom of Aksum had firmly established itself as a wealthy and influential power in the Horn of Africa. With growing trade networks, a centralized monarchy, and strong diplomatic ties to the Roman and Byzantine worlds, Aksum stood at a pivotal crossroads, both geographically and culturally. It was in this moment of prosperity and global engagement that one of the most significant events in Ethiopian history occurred: the conversion of King Ezana to Christianity. This transformation did not happen in isolation. The spread of Christianity into the Red Sea region was part of a larger movement that had begun in the Eastern Mediterranean centuries earlier. By the 3rd century CE, Christian communities were already established in Egypt, Syria, and Arabia. Merchants, missionaries, and exiles carried the new faith into distant ports, including Adulis, Aksum's crucial harbor on the Red Sea. The story of Ezana's conversion is closely tied to two foreign figures, Frumentius and Aedesius. According to tradition, the two were young Christian Syrians who had been taken captive during a voyage in the Red Sea and brought to the Axumite royal court. There, they gained the trust of the royal family and were entrusted with the education of the crown prince, Ezana. Frumentius, in particular, played a lasting role. After Ezana became king, Frumentius traveled to Alexandria to seek support for spreading Christianity in Aksum. He appealed to Athanasius, the patriarch of the Alexandrian Church, who consecrated Frumentius as bishop and sent him back to Aksum. This act formally linked the Ethiopian Church to the Coptic Church of Egypt, a relationship that would continue for more than a millennium. Ezana's reign marked a profound shift. Inscriptions that had previously invoked traditional gods such as Mahrem began to reference the Christian deity. A notable bilingual inscription in Ge'ez and Greek, erected by Ezana, declares the king's faith in the God who made heaven and earth, a clear break from the pre-Christian pantheon. The king also adopted Christian symbols on Axumite coinage, replacing the disc and crescent with the cross. Ezana's conversion was not only a personal spiritual decision, but a political act with wide-reaching consequences. By embracing Christianity, he aligned Aksum with the Roman and Byzantine empires, both of which were increasingly Christianized. This gave Aksum access to new diplomatic and economic opportunities, while also setting it apart from its southern Arabian rivals, who followed different religious traditions. Internally, the adoption of Christianity gave the monarchy a new ideological foundation. Just as earlier kings had associated themselves with warrior gods to justify their authority, Ezana now ruled as a Christian monarch with divine-sanctioned churches were likely constructed, and Christian teachings began to spread among the population, though the exact pace and depth of conversion remain unclear. This transition also laid the groundwork for the development of a distinct Ethiopian Christian identity. Over time, Christianity in Ethiopia took on unique characteristics, blending with local traditions, languages, and customs. Ge'ez, already used in royal inscriptions, became the language of scripture and liturgy. The Bible was translated into Ge'ez, and early monastic communities began to form. Ezana's reign was marked not only by religious transformation but also by continued military and administrative achievements. Inscriptions describe campaigns against neighboring groups such as the Beja and the Nobatai to the west and north, reaffirming Aksum's military strength. Ezana styled himself as King of Axumites, Himyarites, and Sabaeans, reflecting the reach of his influence across the Red Sea into Arabia. One of the most informative documents from Ezana's time is the stone inscription found in Meroe in modern-day Sudan. Written in Greek, the text recounts Ezana's military expedition against the Nubian kingdom of Kush. This campaign likely took place in response to regional instability or threats to trade routes. The inscription describes the defeat of Kushite forces and the capture of prisoners, livestock, and resources. By defeating Kush, Ezana not only expanded Axumite power, but also marked the final blow to one of Africa's other ancient civilizations. The fall of Kush symbolized a changing power dynamic in the region. With Aksum now clearly dominant, Ezana's adoption of the title King of Kings reflects this growing imperial identity. It suggested authority not just over Aksum, but over multiple subordinate kingdoms and peoples. This model of kingship would be replicated in later Ethiopian history, where emperors claimed descent from Solomon and ruled over a diverse collection of regions and ethnic groups. The Christianization of Axum also brought about changes in art, symbolism, and architecture. While archaeological evidence from this period is limited, surviving coins and inscriptions show a clear adoption of Christian motifs. Later traditions credit Ezana with the foundation of churches and support for the early Ethiopian church hierarchy. His reign became a model for the Christian kings who followed. Importantly, Ezana's conversion ensured that Christianity in Ethiopia would be closely linked to the monarchy itself. Unlike in other parts of Africa, where Christianity arrived through colonial powers centuries later, in Ethiopia it was embraced by a native king and became part of the empire's core identity. This fact remains a point of pride in Ethiopian history and a key element in its national narrative. Following the conversion of King Ezana and the formal adoption of Christianity, the kingdom of Aksum entered its most prosperous and internationally visible phase. From the mid-4th to the 6th century CE, Aksum stood as one of the great powers of the late ancient world, exerting influence across the Red Sea, engaging in global trade networks, and maintaining diplomatic ties with powerful empires, particularly the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. This was the age when Aksum reached the height of its territorial, economic, and political strength. The kingdom's influence extended far beyond its core in the Ethiopian and Eritrean highlands. Axumite rulers claimed dominion not only over the interior but also over the Arabian coastline, across parts of modern-day Yemen, and over many regional peoples and polities. One of the clearest indicators of Aksum's power in this period is its continued coinage. Beginning with King Ezana, Axumite rulers minted gold, silver, and bronze coins, often inscribed in Greek, later transitioning into the Ge'ez script. These coins did more than facilitate commerce. They conveyed imperial authority and religious identity. They depicted crowned kings, Christian crosses, and inscriptions declaring the king as the servant of Christ, signaling both internal legitimacy and external messaging. By issuing coinage, Aksum became one of the few sub-Saharan African civilizations to establish a standardized monetary system, and one of the very few to issue gold coins. These coins have been found as far away as India, Egypt, and the Levant, demonstrating the wide reach of Aksum's trade connections. Trade was the engine that powered Aksum's economy and allowed it to flourish on the world stage. Through its port at Adulis, Aksum became a major player in the Red Sea trade. Goods from the African interior, including ivory, rhinoceros horn, gold, obsidian, frankincense, and slaves, were brought to Aksum's capital and exported abroad. In return, Aksum imported fine textiles, glassware, wine, ceramics, and metal goods from the Mediterranean and the Middle East. The Red Sea, in this era, was a vital artery for commerce between the Roman Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean world. Aksum's control of Adulis gave it strategic leverage over this route. By taxing goods and providing safe harbor, Aksum accumulated wealth and enhanced its regional importance. This period also saw Aksum engage in formal diplomacy with other powers. The Byzantine Empire, in particular, recognized Aksum as a fellow Christian kingdom and strategic ally. Historical texts by writers such as Cosmas Indicopleustes, a 6th-century Alexandrian merchant and Christian monk, refer to Aksum as one of the world's great powers. Alongside Byzantium, Persia, and China, Cosmas visited Aksum and recorded valuable observations about its church life, customs, and economic activity. He praised the strength of Aksum's Christian faith and described the kingdom as a bastion of orthodoxy in the midst of a shifting religious landscape. His writings, though sometimes shaped by theological bias, confirm that Aksum was widely known and respected in the Mediterranean world. One of the most striking episodes of Axumite power during this time was its military intervention in southern Arabia. By the early 6th century CE, Aksum had extended its influence across the Red Sea into the Himyarite kingdom in what is today Yemen. The Himyarite rulers had recently converted to Judaism and were engaged in conflict with the region's Christian population. According to both Ethiopian and external sources, a Himyarite king named Yusuf Asar Yathar, also known by the Christian chroniclers as Du Nuwas, persecuted Christian communities, particularly in the city of Najran. in response to appeals from Arabian Christians and with support from the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. The Axumite king Caleb launched a major military campaign, King Caleb's invasion of Himyar, around the early 6th century CE, is one of the best documented foreign expeditions in Axumite history. Axumite forces crossed the Red Sea, defeated the Himyarite army, and installed a Christian client ruler named Sumyafa Ashwa on the throne. This victory not only avenged the massacre at Najran, but also established Axumite control over a key area of the Arabian Peninsula. Caleb's success was celebrated in both Ethiopian tradition and external sources. Greek inscriptions in South Arabia, written by Axumite commanders, commemorate the campaign. Byzantine writers hailed Caleb as a Christian hero, and churches in the empire likely honored him as a defender of the faith. However, Axumite control over Himyar proved difficult to maintain. Within a few decades, the region fell into rebellion, and another Axumite general, Abraha, took power independently. Though still identifying as Christian and maintaining some ties to Aksum, Abraha ruled autonomously and launched his own campaigns, including the famous but semi-legendary March on Mecca, referenced in later Islamic tradition. Despite these complications, Aksum's ability to project power across the Red Sea and influence Arabian politics shows the kingdom's strategic depth and naval capability. Few African polities of the time possessed such reach. Back home, the Axumite capital continued to develop. The monumental stelae fields remained important ceremonial and burial sites, though the construction of new stelae appears to have slowed. Christian churches were likely built during this period, though much of the architecture from this era has not survived in complete form. Nonetheless, archaeological remains, inscriptions, and coins offer a rich picture of a cosmopolitan, literate, and devout society. The 6th century CE was also a time of religious consolidation. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, still closely connected to the Coptic Church of Alexandria, played a growing role in education, record-keeping, and moral guidance. Monastic life began to flourish, and Ge'ez continued to evolve as both a sacred and administrative language. The kingdom's prosperity and expansion were not without challenges. Managing a trans-Red Sea empire required resources and coordination. Aksum had to maintain loyalty among diverse ethnic and religious groups, and the cost of military campaigns could strain the economy. Climate and environmental factors, such as soil degradation or changing rainfall patterns, also began to affect agricultural productivity. As the 6th century gave way to the 7th, the kingdom of Aksum, once a vibrant center of commerce, religion, and imperial ambition, began to experience a long, uneven decline. This decline was not the result of a single catastrophic event, nor was it marked by a dramatic military defeat. Instead, it was the product of a combination of environmental, economic, and geopolitical shifts that gradually weakened the empire's foundations. One of the most significant factors contributing to Aksum's decline was environmental degradation. The Ethiopian highlands, while fertile and agriculturally productive, were vulnerable to overexploitation. As the population grew and agriculture expanded to support urban centers and trade, deforestation and soil exhaustion began to take a toll. With fewer trees to protect the soil, erosion increased and once productive farmland became less reliable. Climatic changes may have compounded these pressures. Some historians and climatologists suggest that during this period, there was a shift toward drier conditions in the Horn of Africa. A reduction in rainfall would have had a direct impact on agricultural yields, water availability, and the sustainability of rural life. Such environmental stress would have eroded the economic base upon which the empire rested. Parallel to these internal challenges was a dramatic reordering of the regional trade networks. For centuries, Aksum had prospered through its control of the Red Sea trade routes, linking the African interior with the Mediterranean, the Near East, and the Indian Ocean. However, this system began to change rapidly in the 7th century with the rise of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula. The emergence of Islamic polities, beginning with the Rashidun Caliphate and later the Umayyad and Abbasid empires, fundamentally altered the political and religious landscape of the Red Sea region. As Muslim merchants gained dominance over maritime trade, Axumite control of key coastal ports, such as Adulis, diminished. These ports either fell into disuse or were absorbed into the expanding Islamic world, cutting Aksum off from its vital economic lifeline. Unlike in earlier centuries, when Aksum had the ability to project military power across the Red Sea, by the 8th century such interventions had become impossible. The loss of overseas possessions in southern Arabia removed a significant source of prestige and revenue, while the decline of Adulis as a trade hub limited Aksum's access to imported goods and foreign markets. The Islamic expansion also disrupted Aksum's religious alliances. Previously, Aksum had enjoyed close ties with the Christian Byzantine Empire, both economically and symbolically. But as Byzantium's influence in the East waned and Muslim powers became dominant across North Africa and the Near East, Christian Aksum found itself increasingly isolated. The loss of its Christian neighbors and the encirclement by Muslim-controlled territories placed additional strain on its diplomatic options. Some sources suggest that during the early Islamic period, the Ethiopian monarchy maintained peaceful relations with the Muslim world. A well-known Islamic tradition holds that early Muslim refugees, fleeing persecution in Mecca, were granted asylum by the Christian king of Aksum, a ruler often referred to in Islamic texts as the Negus. This tradition reflects a moment of tolerance and coexistence, but it does not appear to have translated into long-term strategic alliances or economic benefit for Aksum internally. The political structure of the kingdom began to show signs of strain. The central monarchy, once the engine of expansion and reform, gradually weakened. While the king remained a symbolic figure of unity and religious authority, his practical control over distant provinces and diverse communities began to erode. Regional nobles, tribal leaders, and local governors exercised increasing autonomy, especially in areas farther from the capital. The archaeological record suggests a shift in population centers during this time. The city of Aksum itself, once a bustling urban and religious hub, appears to have been slowly abandoned. Monumental construction ceased and evidence of large-scale habitation declines. Some historians argue that the capital was moved to the south or relocated to more defensible or agriculturally sustainable areas. Others suggest that the monarchy adopted a more itinerant model, moving from place to place rather than maintaining a fixed center of power. Despite this decline in urban life and political cohesion, the cultural and religious legacy of Aksum endured. Christianity remained a central feature of Ethiopian identity, and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church continued its traditions, even as external support from Egypt and Byzantium became more limited. Monasteries and rural churches preserved religious texts, educated clergy, and sustained a sense of continuity. It is during this period that the mythic and symbolic importance of Aksum was reinforced in historical memory. While its physical influence diminished, its spiritual and dynastic legacy grew. Later Ethiopian rulers would look back to Aksum as the origin of their Christian kingdom and as evidence of their unique place in African and world history. Aksum's script, Ge'ez, continued to evolve into a sacred language used for liturgy and scholarship. Though it ceased to be spoken in daily life, it became a cornerstone of religious and intellectual life in the centuries that followed. With the decline of Aksum in the centuries following the 6th century CE, Ethiopia entered a period marked by regional fragmentation and reduced international visibility. Yet, during this quieter era, a powerful new dynasty rose to prominence in the Ethiopian highlands. Known as the Zagwe Dynasty, this Christian monarchy revived centralized rule, deepened the influence of Orthodox Christianity, and left behind one of the most iconic legacies in Ethiopian history: rock-hewn churches carved from living stone. The Zagwe dynasty ruled from approximately the early 9th or 10th century until the late 13th century, though precise dates remain debated among scholars due to the limited contemporary documentation. Unlike the Axumite kings who traced their ancestry to the Solomonic line, claiming descent from King Solomon of Israel and the Queen of Sheba, the Zagwe rulers originated from a different lineage, likely rooted in the Agaw people of the northern and central Ethiopian highlands. The Agaw were one of the many ethnic groups living within the Ethiopian plateau. During the decline of Axum, they began to assert more autonomy and political authority, eventually leading to the emergence of a new ruling class. The founder of the Zagwe line is traditionally named as Mara Takla Haymanot. According to Ethiopian chronicles, he was a military leader or nobleman who married into the Axumite royal family, which helped him legitimize his rule, though this tradition may have been a later effort to connect the Zagwe to their more prestigious Axumite predecessors. Unlike the Axumite kings who had dominated trade routes and engaged with foreign powers, the Zagwe rulers focused more intensely on internal development, religious reform, and cultural consolidation. Their capital was located at Roha, which would later be renamed Lalibela in honor of its most famous monarch. From this base, the Zagwe kings governed over a predominantly Christian population, maintained a degree of centralized authority, and worked closely with the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. One of the most remarkable features of the Zagwe period was the dynasty's commitment to Christianity, not just as a faith, but as a state-defining institution. The Zagwe monarchs were often seen not merely as political rulers, but as spiritual figures. They promoted monasticism, sponsored church construction, and sought to uphold religious purity and doctrine. This deeply theocratic model of kingship shaped Ethiopian identity for generations to come. Nowhere is this religious devotion more visibly expressed than in the construction of the famous rock-hewn churches of Lalibela. These churches, carved directly into the volcanic rock of the Lasta Mountains, remain a marvel of medieval architecture and spiritual engineering. According to tradition, they were built under the direction of King Gebre Meskel Lalibela, who ruled in the late 12th or early 13th century. King Lalibela is said to have envisioned the creation of a New Jerusalem in response to the Muslim conquest of Jerusalem in the Holy Land. The churches he commissioned were not ordinary structures. They were meant to embody a sacred geography, complete with symbolic names such as the River Jordan flowing between them. There are 11 major churches at Lalibela, including Beta Medhain Alam, Beta Mariam, and the cross-shaped Beta Georgis. These structures were carved from the top down, with workers chiseling into the bedrock to form roofs, walls, and detailed interiors, all connected by a network of trenches and tunnels. The scale and sophistication of the project reflect not only advanced architectural techniques, but also a powerful religious vision backed by royal patronage. Today, these churches are recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and continue to serve as active centers of worship. While the rock-hewn churches are the most famous symbol of the Zagwe era, the dynasty also left behind a legacy of manuscript production, theological discourse, and ecclesiastical organization. Monasteries and churches served as centers of learning, preserving religious texts in the Ge'ez language, and educating generations of clergy. Hagiographies, or saints' lives, flourished as a literary genre, blending Christian piety with Ethiopian cultural narratives. Despite the dynasty's cultural and religious contributions, the Zagwe period was not free from political challenges. The question of dynastic legitimacy lingered throughout their rule. Since the Zagwe did not descend from the Solomonic line, some factions within Ethiopia, particularly ecclesiastical and noble elites, continued to regard them as usurpers over time. This discontent created a powerful ideological opening for rival claimants to press their ancestral claims to the throne. The end of the Zagwe dynasty came in the late 13th century, when a new political force emerged under the leadership of Yakuno, Amlak Yakuno. Amlak claimed direct descent from the Solomonic line, tracing his ancestry back to Menelik, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. With the support of monastic leaders and factions dissatisfied with Zagwe rule, he led a revolt that resulted in the overthrow of the last Zagwe king, traditionally named as Yetbarak. The transition from the Zagwe to the Solomonic dynasty was more than a change of rulers. It was a transformation in how political authority was legitimized. While the Zagwe had relied on their religious devotion and cultural achievements to assert power, the Solomonic kings would claim divine right based on their genealogical connection to biblical royalty. The fall of the Zagwe Dynasty in the late 13th century ushered in one of the most ideologically significant transformations in Ethiopian history. This moment marked not just the ascent of a new ruler, but the deliberate restoration of a royal lineage claiming divine descent. With the coronation of Yakuno Amlak around the year 1270, the Solomonic dynasty was reborn, reviving ancient traditions, reshaping the meaning of kingship, and setting the stage for centuries of imperial rule. The Solomonic claim to legitimacy was rooted in a compelling narrative that Ethiopia's rulers were descended from Menelik, the son of King Solomon of Israel and the Queen of Sheba. According to Ethiopian tradition, this union produced a royal line that began with Menelik's return from Jerusalem to Ethiopia, carrying the Ark of the Covenant. Though this tale had existed in oral form for generations, it gained new authority with the restoration of the Solomonic line and became central to Ethiopian imperial ideology. Yakuno Amlak positioned himself not only as a political leader, but as the rightful heir to this biblical lineage. His rise was not merely a military conquest, but a theological and cultural realignment. By overthrowing the Zagwe rulers, who were widely viewed as religiously devout but genealogically disconnected from Solomon, Yakuno Amlak framed his rule as a return to divine order. This restoration of the Solomonic line was seen as both a spiritual and national renewal. The movement that brought Yakuno Amlak to power was not a spontaneous rebellion. It had deep roots in the religious and social structure of the Ethiopian highlands. Monastic communities, particularly in regions such as Shewa and Amhara, played a central role in organizing opposition to the Zagwe and promoting the Solomonic cause. These monasteries were not merely spiritual centers, but also hubs of education, manuscript preservation, and political thought. Their support gave Yakuno Amlak both moral authority and logistical strength. One of the most influential clerics of the time was Abba Georgis of Gasuch, a scholar and monk whose writings and sermons helped promote the concept of the king as a divinely anointed figure. Figures like Abba Georgis helped construct the ideological foundation for Solomonic kingship, emphasizing the sacred nature of royal blood and the king's duty to uphold the orthodox faith upon taking the throne. Yakuno Amlak quickly worked to consolidate his power and secure recognition from religious institutions. He re-established ties with the Coptic Church in Alexandria, reaffirming the Ethiopian Church's historical dependence on the Alexandrian Patriarch for the appointment of bishops. This connection helped reinforce the legitimacy of his rule while integrating Ethiopian Christianity into the broader Coptic tradition. The Solomonic Restoration was not just about symbolism, it also marked a shift in political administration. Yakuno Amlak and his successors undertook efforts to expand central authority beyond the core highland regions. They appointed provincial governors known as Ras and Dejazmach, tasked with collecting tribute and maintaining order. Although Ethiopia would remain a patchwork of regional powers for much of its history, the Solomonic monarchs sought to project the image of a unified Christian empire governed under the divine mandate of the king. During this early period of restoration, court chronicles began to emerge as a form of royal record-keeping. These chronicles documented the deeds of each emperor, often linking their reigns to biblical analogies and emphasizing their religious devotion. Though these texts sometimes blended history with legend, they played a vital role in shaping the narrative of Ethiopian kingship and preserving the memory of imperial achievements. A particularly important cultural development during this time was the growing prominence of the Kebra Nagast, or the Glory of Kings. This text, likely compiled and written during the early Solomonic period, brought together earlier oral traditions, religious beliefs, and political ideology. It told the story of the Queen of Sheba's visit to King Solomon, the birth of Menelik, and the Ark of the Covenant's journey to Ethiopia. The Kebra Nagast presented Ethiopia as a second Israel and its kings as protectors of a sacred legacy. The text was not merely literature, It was a tool of governance and identity. With the restoration of the Solomonic line, Ethiopia began to redefine its place in the Christian world. While geographically distant from Europe and the Near East, Ethiopian rulers saw themselves as equals to other Christian monarchs. Over time, this identity would be projected outward, contributing to later legends such as that of Prester John, a mythical Christian king believed by Europeans to rule in a distant eastern land. The early Solomonic emperors also strengthened their alliance with the church by endowing monasteries, supporting the construction of churches, and promoting Orthodox Christian doctrine. They actively suppressed heretical movements and sought to bring remote regions under the moral authority of the church. In doing so, they deepened the intertwining of religious and political life in Ethiopia. Despite these efforts, the Solomonic kings still faced significant challenges. The Ethiopian highlands remained a difficult terrain to govern. Local nobles retained considerable autonomy, and the emperor's authority often depended on maintaining complex networks of marriage alliances, military loyalties, and ecclesiastical support. The early Solomonic state was not a centralized bureaucracy, but a sacred kingship navigating a patchwork of shifting regional powers. Yet the symbolic weight of the Solomonic claim proved remarkably resilient. It gave Ethiopian monarchs a narrative of continuity, stretching back to biblical times. Even when material conditions were harsh and the state faced fragmentation, the idea of a divinely ordained empire persisted. The early centuries of the restored Solomonic dynasty laid the ideological and religious foundation of Ethiopian kingship. But it was under Emperor Amda Seyon I that these foundations were translated into aggressive imperial expansion and centralized statecraft. Ruling during the first half of the 14th century, Amda Seyon I not only solidified the authority of the Solomonic line, but also led one of the most dynamic periods of military conquest in Ethiopian history. His reign marked a critical shift from ideological restoration to practical consolidation and territorial ambition. Amda Seyon I, whose name means Pillar of Zion, ascended to the throne in the early 14th century, during a period of increasing tension between the Christian Highland Kingdom and the surrounding Muslim polities. At this time, the Ethiopian Empire was surrounded by a mosaic of independent sultanates, emirates, and pastoral communities, many of which had resisted incorporation into the Christian imperial structure. The religious and political fragmentation of the region presented both an obstacle and an opportunity for the growing Ethiopian state. Unlike his predecessors, who had primarily relied on legitimacy through lineage and religion, Amda Seyon I aggressively pursued military campaigns as a means of asserting authority and expanding the empire's borders. He inherited a kingdom that was still fragile and contested, and he sought to secure both internal loyalty and external submission through a series of coordinated conquests and strategic governance. One of the defining features of Amda Seyon's reign was his sustained military engagement with the Muslim sultanates in the east and southeast, particularly the Sultanate of Ifat. The Sultanate of Ifat had grown into a significant regional power in the wake of the Ayyubid and Mamluk influence in the Red Sea area. It occupied a strategic position between the Ethiopian highlands and the coastal lowlands, controlling trade routes and serving as a religious and cultural center of Islam in the region. The relationship between the Ethiopian Christian Empire and the Muslim sultanates had long been uneasy. While earlier rulers had maintained occasional peace with their Muslim neighbors, religious competition and economic rivalry increasingly fueled hostilities. Amda Seyon I perceived the growing power of Ifat and its allies as a direct challenge to the stability and sovereignty of the Ethiopian state. The emperor launched a series of military campaigns, documented in both royal chronicles and oral traditions, that resulted in the subjugation of Ifat and several other Muslim principalities. These campaigns were not simply raids or punitive expeditions. They were sustained efforts aimed at restructuring the political map of the region. Towns were taken, fortresses destroyed, and rulers replaced with figures loyal to the Solomonic crown. One of the key figures in this resistance was Sultan Sabr ad-Din of Ifat, who led multiple efforts to resist Ethiopian domination. Sabur ad-Din's forces engaged in open warfare with Amda Seon's army, but after successive defeats, he was captured and imprisoned. The Sultanate was subsequently divided and placed under Ethiopian oversight, though resistance would continue in various forms for generations. Amda Seon's military campaigns extended beyond Ifat. He marched into regions such as Dawaro, Hadia, and Bile, bringing them under imperial control. These territories, often located in rugged and remote areas, required a combination of force and administrative integration. The emperor established a pattern of installing governors, demanding tribute, and reinforcing religious institutions to secure loyalty. These conquests were often justified not only in political terms but also as religious wars. Amda Seon's chroniclers portrayed him as a defender of the Christian faith and a warrior king anointed by God. His battles were framed as a righteous struggle against unbelievers and rebels, which helped rally popular support and clergy endorsement. The language used in royal records and ecclesiastical writings emphasized divine favor and destiny, reinforcing the sacral nature of the monarchy. The emperor's ambitions, however, were not limited to military campaigns. He worked to strengthen the administrative apparatus of the state. Amda Seon centralized royal authority by increasing oversight of provincial lords, introducing more consistent systems of taxation and tribute collection, and expanding the role of the church in governance. While the Ethiopian state remained decentralized in practice, with regional lords wielding considerable power, Amda Seon's reforms laid the groundwork for greater imperial cohesion. Cultural and religious life also flourished under his rule. The court of Amda Seon supported the creation of religious texts, the copying of manuscripts, and the expansion of monastic education. Ge'ez continued to serve as the liturgical and scholarly language, with religious poetry and theological commentary becoming increasingly sophisticated. The integration of newly conquered regions also led to the spread of Orthodox Christianity into areas previously outside the Church's reach. Despite his success, Amda Seon's reign was not without resistance and unrest. His campaigns created long-standing resentment among Muslim communities, some of whom would later form the basis of future uprisings. Additionally, the incorporation of diverse ethnic and religious groups into the empire introduced new tensions. The emperor relied heavily on military strength and religious legitimacy to maintain order, but the fragility of imperial unity would continue to challenge his successors. Nonetheless, the legacy of Amda Seon I is substantial. He expanded the geographical reach of the Ethiopian Empire more than any ruler since the days of Aksum. He also established a model of Christian kingship that combined military leadership, religious devotion, and administrative discipline. His reign is remembered in Ethiopian history as a time of confidence, assertiveness, and cultural strength. Amda Seon's model of kingship became a template for future emperors. His fusion of religious authority and military prowess would continue to define the role of the Ethiopian monarch for centuries. His expansionist policies and conflicts with Muslim neighbors also set the stage for future clashes that would periodically erupt across the region. In the aftermath of the territorial and military expansions led by Emperor Amda Seon I, the Ethiopian Empire entered a new and dynamic phase of cultural development. The 14th and 15th centuries witnessed a flourishing of religious scholarship, literary production, artistic expression, and institutional growth, particularly within the Orthodox Christian monastic tradition. This period of Renaissance did not just follow in the wake of military conquest. It built upon it, transforming Ethiopia's religious, intellectual, and cultural landscape in enduring ways. The Solomonic emperors who followed Amda Seon I inherited a more stable and territorially expansive realm, with many of the surrounding Muslim principalities weakened or subdued, and internal challenges temporarily subdued. The imperial court shifted attention to strengthening the ideological and cultural foundations of the state. Monasteries, royal chronicles, hagiographies, and religious poetry became central to how the empire articulated its identity and projected its authority. One of the most significant developments during this period was the proliferation of royal chronicles. These were written records, often commissioned by emperors themselves, that documented the reigns, deeds, and religious contributions of successive monarchs. While these texts were sometimes stylized and designed to emphasize divine favor, they also preserved invaluable historical detail. Chroniclers often recorded military campaigns, political alliances, church-building activities, and signs of divine intervention, all through the lens of a deeply Christian worldview. The language of these chronicles was Ge'ez, the classical language of liturgy, learning, and administration. Though no longer used in everyday speech, Ge'ez remained the medium through which Ethiopian intellectual life thrived. Scribes and scholars trained in monasteries were responsible for producing manuscripts that copied not only chronicles, but also theological treatises, biblical commentaries, translations of foreign texts, and original religious poetry. Monasticism, already an important feature of Ethiopian Christianity, expanded significantly during this era. Monasteries were not isolated spiritual retreats. They were vibrant centers of education, manuscript production, and local governance. Many monasteries maintained close ties to the royal court, and some served as the educational institutions for future ecclesiastical leaders and bureaucrats. One of the most important monastic figures of this period was Saint Takla Haymanot. Though his life likely straddled the 13th and 14th centuries, his influence grew in the centuries that followed. He was credited with founding the Debre Libanos Monastery in Shewa, which became one of the most prominent and powerful religious institutions in Ethiopia. Takla Haymanot was celebrated for his asceticism, miracles, and missionary zeal, and his hagiography became widely circulated and revered. Another monastic scholar of note was Abba Georgis of Gasuch, who continued to contribute significantly to theological debate and the promotion of orthodox doctrine. His writings explored themes of monastic discipline, heresy, and divine kingship, helping to reinforce both religious orthodoxy and imperial ideology. In addition to theological works, the era saw a flourishing of religious poetry and hymns. One prominent genre was the makdas, or sacred praises, which were performed during liturgical ceremonies and festivals. These poetic compositions often exalted the Virgin Mary, saints, and biblical events, reinforcing the devotional life of the Christian faithful and enriching the ceremonial experience of the church calendar. The role of the Virgin Mary became particularly prominent in Ethiopian religious life. During this period, Marian devotion intensified, inspired by both imported texts and indigenous theological reflection. The compilation of Wedis Mariam, or Praises of Mary, offered daily hymns that became staples of Ethiopian Christian piety. This growing emphasis on Mary paralleled trends in the wider Orthodox Christian world, especially in Egypt and the Eastern Roman Empire. Art and architecture also reflected this cultural revival. Church paintings, illuminated manuscripts, and wooden carvings adorned religious spaces with vibrant iconography. While earlier Axumite and Zagwe architecture had emphasized stone churches and monumental stelae, the Solomonic period began to emphasize wall paintings and colorful manuscripts as means of visual communication. These artworks were not merely decorative. They served pedagogical purposes, illustrating biblical scenes, saints' lives, and theological principles for audiences who may not have been literate. Regional diversity in artistic expression began to emerge. Different regions of the empire developed distinctive styles of iconography and manuscript illustration, often influenced by local culture, environmental conditions, and patronage. Despite these variations, there was a strong commitment to maintaining theological consistency and adherence to orthodox norms. The imperial court supported this cultural flowering by patronizing monasteries, commissioning texts, and funding the copying of religious literature. Emperors saw themselves as custodians of not only the state, but also the faith. Their piety was demonstrated through church building, endowment of monastic lands, and participation in major religious festivals. Such actions reinforced their legitimacy in the eyes of both the clergy and the people. In addition to patronage, emperors occasionally intervened in theological debates and ecclesiastical administration. As tensions occasionally arose between local practices and central church authority, the monarchs acted as arbiters. This balance of power helped maintain unity within the Ethiopian Church, even as it navigated doctrinal challenges and external pressures. The cultural and religious renaissance of the 14th and 15th centuries also had diplomatic dimensions. Ethiopia continued to cultivate its identity as a Christian kingdom in a largely Muslim region. Though geopolitical isolation remained a challenge, there were intermittent efforts to re-establish contact with other Christian polities. Letters were exchanged with the Coptic Patriarch in Alexandria, and occasional embassies were sent abroad. These communications helped Ethiopia maintain its connection to the broader Christian world, even as it developed a uniquely Ethiopian tradition. One example of cross-cultural interest in Ethiopia during this time was the rise of the European legend of Prester John, a mythical Christian king said to rule a wealthy and virtuous land in the east. While the story had no factual basis, many European travelers and monarchs believed that Ethiopia might be the home of this fabled ruler. As a result, Ethiopia began to appear on European maps and in royal correspondence, rekindling long-dormant ties with distant Christian kingdoms. Despite the flourishing of culture, learning, and religion, underlying tensions remained. Ethiopia was still a multi-ethnic empire with diverse religious communities. The integration of new territories brought challenges in governance, particularly in regions with Muslim populations or local traditions that differed from central church doctrine. Maintaining cohesion required constant effort, negotiation, and the ability to mediate between imperial ideals and local realities. The cultural renaissance and religious expansion of the 14th century set the stage for one of the most pivotal reigns in the history of the Ethiopian Empire. When Emperor Zara Yakob came to the throne in the mid-15th century, he inherited a kingdom that was both flourishing and fragile, an empire rich in faith, culture, and military tradition, but increasingly burdened by religious heterodoxy, political fragmentation, and social unrest. His reign marked a turning point as he undertook ambitious reforms to centralize royal power and enforce religious orthodoxy across the realm. Zara Yakob, whose name means seed of Jacob, ascended the throne during a time of instability. Born in Shewa and crowned emperor in the year 1434, he faced immediate challenges to his authority from both secular elites and ecclesiastical rivals. The empire had grown increasingly decentralized, with powerful regional lords exercising considerable autonomy, often challenging the emperor's decisions or ignoring royal decrees altogether. Within the church, divergent theological views and local customs threatened to undermine uniform doctrine and weaken the legitimacy of the Orthodox faith. From the outset of his reign, Zara Yakob made it clear that he would tolerate neither political insubordination nor religious deviation. He saw the unity of the empire as dependent on the unity of the faith, and he took swift steps to suppress heresies, reform church administration, and assert imperial control over both religious and secular institutions. One of Zara Yakob's first and most enduring policies was his effort to standardize Orthodox Christian doctrine throughout the empire. He convened religious councils, summoned bishops and monastic leaders, and demanded that all regions adhere to a uniform set of teachings and practices. Among the most pressing concerns was the rise of heterodox groups such as the Stephanites, named after a monk named Abba Estefanos. The Stephanites rejected the veneration of images and saints, emphasized strict asceticism, and challenged certain church rituals, including fasting regulations and liturgical customs. Zara Yakob viewed these teachings as not only theological errors, but also political threats. The Stephanites' refusal to participate in imperial religious ceremonies and their rejection of church hierarchy undermined both royal and ecclesiastical authority. In response, the emperor ordered a crackdown on their leaders, confiscated their writings, and subjected dissenters to imprisonment or exile. In extreme cases, persecution included execution, reflecting the intensity with which Zara Yakob pursued religious conformity. While these actions might appear harsh through modern eyes, they were driven by a vision of unity and divine order. For Zara Yakob, the empire was not merely a political entity. It was a sacred kingdom whose legitimacy rested on its role as the protector of true faith. In his writings, the emperor emphasized the king's divine mandate, comparing his role to that of biblical figures who ruled with righteousness and defended the covenant of God. Zara Yakob was not only a reformer, but also a prolific author. He composed several theological treatises, homilies, and royal chronicles that articulated his understanding of kingship, morality, and religious duty. One of his most notable works, the Metzahaf Burhan, or Book of Light, outlined his views on divine justice, the sanctity of the monarchy, and the responsibilities of both rulers and subjects. These writings reveal a deeply intellectual and spiritually engaged monarch, one who saw no separation between faith and governance. His efforts to reform the church extended beyond doctrine. Zara Yakob intervened in ecclesiastical appointments, ensuring that loyal and capable individuals held positions of authority. He supported the expansion of monasteries, encouraged the copying of religious manuscripts, and reinforced the use of Ge'ez as the sacred language of liturgy and scholarship. These actions helped to further cement the Orthodox Church as a pillar of Ethiopian identity and continuity. Beyond religious affairs, Zara Yakob took steps to strengthen the administrative structure of the empire. He reasserted royal control over land grants, often revoking privileges previously given to nobles who failed to fulfill their duties or challenged imperial authority. This policy not only enhanced central control, but also ensured that the empire's economic resources were directed towards supporting state and church institutions. Zara Yakob also sought to regularize taxation and improve communications between the center and the provinces. Though Ethiopia's mountainous terrain and diverse population made centralized governance difficult, the emperor worked to create a more cohesive system of oversight. Royal messengers and emissaries were dispatched to enforce decrees, collect tribute, and monitor local governors' relations with neighboring states and foreign powers were also part of Zara Yakob's agenda. While his reign was not marked by large-scale military campaigns like those of Amda Seyon I, he maintained a strong defensive posture. He dealt with incursions from the Muslim principalities to the east and southeast and supported Christian missions in contested regions. During his reign, Ethiopia's contact with the wider Christian world began to increase again. European interest in Ethiopia had been rekindled by the enduring legend of Prester John, and Zara Yakob's court received emissaries from distant kingdoms. Though full diplomatic relations with Europe would develop more fully under his successors, the emperor's reign marked a renewed recognition of Ethiopia as a significant Christian polity on the global stage. In his later years, Zara Yakob's rule became more autocratic. Sources suggest that he grew increasingly suspicious of disloyalty within the court and even among members of his own family. Some chronicles recount acts of paranoia, including the punishment of courtiers and clerics he believed to be plotting against him. Whether these accounts reflect actual events or are the result of later political narrative construction is difficult to determine, but they do highlight the intensity of his commitment to control and reform. As the Ethiopian Empire moved into the late 15th and early 16th centuries, its world was beginning to shift. Trade patterns were evolving, regional powers were growing restless, and the global spread of Christianity was taking new forms. Amidst these changes, Ethiopia's long isolation from the broader Christian world began to break. It was during this period that the empire entered into direct contact with Europe, most notably with Portugal, marking the start of a complex and consequential chapter in its history. At the center of this emerging relationship was one of the most persistent legends in European imagination, the myth of Prester John. The legend of Prester John had circulated in Europe since the 12th century. He was believed to be a powerful Christian monarch, ruling over a wealthy and noble kingdom somewhere in the east, perhaps in India, Central Asia, or Africa. Prester John was said to command vast armies, control rivers of gold, and protect Christianity in lands surrounded by Muslims and pagans. While the legend was fictional, it reflected European hopes of finding allies in the global struggle between Christendom and Islam. By the 15th century, as Portuguese navigators pushed further down the African coast and into the Indian Ocean, the possibility of discovering the realm of Prester John regained urgency. With the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in the year 1453, European powers became increasingly desperate to establish new routes to the east and to find Christian allies outside the Islamic world. Ethiopia, an ancient Christian kingdom with a long Orthodox tradition, suddenly became a focus of strategic interest. The first formal contacts between Ethiopia and Portugal occurred in the late 15th century. Letters were exchanged between the Ethiopian emperors and European monarchs, including the kings of Portugal and the popes in Rome. These communications expressed mutual curiosity and a shared interest in reinforcing Christian bonds. However, it was not until the early 16th century that the relationship moved from diplomacy to direct engagement. Under the reign of Emperor Lebna Dengel, who ruled from the early 16th century, Ethiopia faced growing external threats from neighboring Muslim sultanates, particularly the Sultanate of Adal in the southeast. This rivalry intensified during the rise of Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, a charismatic and militant leader known in Ethiopian history as Ahmad Grogn, or Ahmad the Left-Handed. Ahmad launched a jihad against the Ethiopian state, one that would devastate the Christian highlands and bring the empire to the brink of collapse. Faced with such a formidable opponent, Emperor Lebna Dengel turned to Europe for aid. He sent envoys to Portugal, appealing for military assistance. The appeal coincided with Portugal's own interests in expanding its influence along the Red Sea and countering Islamic power in the region. The Portuguese crown, under King João III, responded by dispatching a small but well-equipped expeditionary force led by Cristóvão da Gama, the son of the famous explorer Vasco da Gama. Cristóvão da Gama and his contingent arrived in Ethiopia in the year 1541, bringing with them muskets, cannons, and a trained corps of European soldiers. Though small in number, these forces were technologically advanced and represented a new kind of warfare in the region. The arrival of the Portuguese was met with both relief and complexity. On one hand, the Ethiopian court welcomed their military aid. On the other, the presence of Latin Christians raised tensions within the Ethiopian Orthodox clergy, who were wary of foreign influence on doctrine and ritual together. The Ethiopian and Portuguese forces launched campaigns to resist and roll back Ahmad Grogn's advances. Despite their technological advantages, the conflict was brutal. In one key battle, Cristóvão da Gama was captured and executed by Ahmad's forces. Yet the alliance did not collapse. After years of bitter fighting, Ahmad Grogn was killed in battle in the year 1543, and the Muslim advance was halted. The defeat of Ahmad Grogn was a major turning point, saving the Ethiopian empire from disintegration. However, the victory came at a high cost. Many churches and monasteries had been destroyed, manuscripts lost, and communities displaced. The physical and cultural trauma of the conflict would be felt for generations. The Portuguese presence in Ethiopia, while initially military, also opened the door to religious engagement. Jesuit missionaries arrived in the wake of the military campaign, seeking to bring the Ethiopian Church into communion with the Roman Catholic Church. This effort, however, quickly met resistance. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church had centuries of tradition and saw itself as the rightful heir of early Christian teachings. Attempts by the Jesuits to impose Latin rites, papal authority, or Roman theology were viewed not as helpful contributions but as challenges to Ethiopian spiritual independence. Emperor Lebna Dengel's son and successor, Emperor Galawdewos, attempted to navigate this delicate situation. He welcomed Portuguese support, but firmly defended the teachings and customs of the Ethiopian Orthodox faith. He even wrote a theological treatise rebutting the claims of the Roman Church and affirming the legitimacy of the Alexandrian tradition to which Ethiopian Christianity had long been connected. The 16th century stands as one of the most tumultuous and transformative periods in Ethiopian history. It was a time when the very survival of the Christian empire was brought into question, as powerful religious and political forces collided in a prolonged and devastating conflict. At the heart of this era was the rise of Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, known in Ethiopian history as Ahmad Grang, meaning Ahmad the Left-Handed. His military campaigns, framed as a religious jihad, nearly destroyed the Solomonic kingdom and permanently reshaped the political and religious map of the Horn of Africa. Ahmad Grang rose to prominence within the Sultanate of Adwa, a Muslim polity located in the southeastern region of the Horn of Africa, bordering the Ethiopian highlands. The Sultanate had long-standing tensions with the Christian kingdom due to competition over trade routes, territorial disputes, and religious differences. These conflicts were compounded by the legacy of earlier Ethiopian expansion into Muslim-held territories during the reign of emperors such as Amda Seyon I. In the early decades of the 16th century, Ahmad Grang emerged as a dynamic and charismatic military leader. With a firm command of both strategy and ideology, he began to unite various Muslim factions under the banner of a holy war against the Christian empire. His jihad was not merely political, it was also deeply religious. Ahmad saw himself as a reformer and a defender of Islam, determined to purify his society and confront what he viewed as the aggressive encroachments of Christian power. Ahmad Grang's campaign began around the year 1529, when he launched an invasion into Ethiopian territory. His forces were highly mobile, strategically disciplined, and unlike earlier opponents, they possessed firearms, most notably matchlock muskets obtained through trade with the Ottoman Turks. This technological advantage gave him a decisive edge over many Ethiopian forces, which relied primarily on traditional weaponry such as spears, swords, and bows. The initial Ethiopian response, led by Emperor Lebna Dengel, struggled to contain the rapid advance of Ahmad's army. The imperial forces suffered repeated defeats, and key regions of the Christian highlands were overrun. Towns were captured, churches and monasteries were looted and burned, and thousands of people were killed or displaced. Religious manuscripts and cultural treasures were destroyed in large numbers, leaving a deep scar on Ethiopian heritage. One of the most significant aspects of Ahmad Grang's campaign was the deliberate targeting of Christian institutions. Monasteries that had served as centers of learning and culture for centuries were razed. Churches were not only destroyed but often desecrated, sending a powerful message of religious and psychological domination. In this sense, the conflict was not just a territorial war, it was an existential battle over the soul of the region. By the midpoint of the campaign, Ahmad's forces had penetrated deep into the heart of Ethiopia, capturing many of its most important cities and provinces. Emperor Lebna Dengel was forced into a defensive posture, retreating into the more rugged and remote regions of the highlands. The empire's traditional administrative centers and religious heartlands were now either destroyed or under enemy control. Faced with this crisis, the Ethiopian monarchy turned outward for support. Envoys were sent to the Portuguese in Goa, appealing for military assistance. As previously noted, the Portuguese responded by sending a contingent of troops led by Cristóvão da Gama. This intervention marked a turning point in the conflict. Cristóvão da Gama arrived with several hundred musketeers and a small supply of artillery. Although limited in size, his forces were well-trained and brought advanced military technology. The Portuguese joined with remnants of the Ethiopian army and launched a counteroffensive against Ahmad's forces. Initial battles were intense and costly. At one point, Cristóvão da Gama was captured and executed by Ahmad Grang's soldiers, a significant blow to the morale of the Christian coalition. Yet, despite the loss of their commander, the combined Ethiopian and Portuguese forces regrouped. Emperor Galawdewos, son of Lebna Dengel, emerged as a strong leader during this critical period. rallying his supporters and commanding what remained of the army. He led a renewed campaign to drive out the invaders. The decisive battle occurred in the year 1543 at a site known as Wena Daga. There, Ahmad Gragn was killed in combat, a moment that marked the effective collapse of the Adal invasion. Without his leadership, the cohesion of the Muslim forces deteriorated, and Ethiopian forces quickly regained control of much of their lost territory. The death of Ahmad Gragn did not end all hostilities, but it did mark the beginning of Ethiopia's recovery. The empire, however, emerged from the conflict deeply wounded. Vast regions had been depopulated, religious infrastructure was shattered, and economic systems had been severely disrupted. The once mighty institutions of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church were weakened, and many of its best scholars and monks had perished during the war. The long-term impact of the conflict was also evident in the psychological and religious memory of the Ethiopian people. The destruction wrought by Ahmad Gragn became a defining trauma in Ethiopian history, passed down in oral tradition, chronicles, and liturgical texts. The image of the Muslim invader burning churches and desecrating holy spaces was seared into the collective memory of the nation, reinforcing a sense of religious identity tied to resistance and survival. Politically, the war highlighted the vulnerabilities of the Ethiopian state. While the empire had enjoyed periods of central strength, the vastness and diversity of its territory made it difficult to defend against coordinated attacks. The need for modernization in military organization and weaponry became apparent, even as the Ethiopians had ultimately succeeded with foreign help. In the wake of the devastating Muslim-Christian wars that nearly fractured the Ethiopian empire, a new chapter in the empire's transformation unfolded, not through the clash of foreign armies, but through the steady, widespread movement of peoples. Beginning in the 16th century and continuing well into the 17th, the Oromo Migrations reshaped the political, social, and demographic landscape of the Ethiopian highlands and beyond. Unlike military invasions of the past, these migrations introduced a new, long-term dynamic that would challenge imperial boundaries and alter the very fabric of Ethiopian society. The Oromo people, originally known as the Gala in earlier records, a term now considered outdated and inappropriate, were a Cushitic-speaking group with a complex and highly organized socio-political system. Prior to their large-scale movements, the Oromo were largely concentrated in areas south of the traditional Ethiopian heartland, particularly around the region that today straddles southern Ethiopia and northern Kenya. They were pastoralists and agriculturalists who lived in small clan-based communities, united by a common language and the unique Gada system, a democratic socio-political structure based on generational age sets. The Gada system was central to Oromo identity. It organized society into age grades, each with specific responsibilities, leadership roles, and ceremonial functions. Every 8 years, power would transfer from one group to the next, ensuring a rotation of leadership and a sense of collective governance. This structure helped unify Oromo communities even as they moved across vast territories, allowing them to adapt and reorganize in the face of new challenges. The reasons behind the great Oromo migrations remain the subject of scholarly debate. Some historians suggest environmental factors such as drought or resource scarcity may have played a role. Others point to population pressures or the destabilization caused by the earlier Christian-Muslim wars, which created power vacuums and weakened the ability of both Christian and Muslim polities to defend their frontiers. Whatever the cause, the scale and speed of the migrations were remarkable. Beginning in the mid-16th century, Oromo groups began moving northward and eastward in waves. They did not come as a single army, nor did they aim to overthrow the existing empire in a coordinated fashion. Rather, their movements were decentralized, gradual, and driven by local needs, seeking pasture, water, and new settlements. Yet over time, their presence would be felt across the entire Ethiopian plateau. The Oromo migrations were not purely peaceful. As they entered new territories, they encountered resistance from both Christian and Muslim communities. Clashes were common, and local rulers often found themselves unable to halt the steady advance of Oromo clans. Towns were raided, lands were taken, and regional power dynamics shifted. However, conquest was not the only method of expansion. In many cases, the Oromo intermarried with local populations, integrated existing customs, and formed alliances with regional elites. Their adaptability and decentralized structure allowed them to thrive in diverse environments. In the northern highlands, they settled among Amhara and Tigray communities. In the south and west, they absorbed smaller ethnic groups. In the east, they came into contact with Somali and Afar populations. This ability to accommodate and adapt would later make the Oromo one of the largest and most influential ethnic groups in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian imperial response to the Oromo migrations was complex. Initially, the Solomonic rulers struggled to formulate an effective strategy. The empire was still recovering from the destruction caused by Ahmad Gran's jihad, and its military and administrative systems were overstretched. Emperors such as Lalibela and his successors attempted to repel the Oromo through military expeditions, but these efforts were often short-lived and poorly coordinated. In some regions, local governors negotiated coexistence or even formed joint military alliances with Oromo leaders. In others, efforts were made to convert Oromo communities to Christianity as a means of integration. Over time, certain Oromo clans began to adopt Orthodox Christianity and participate in imperial institutions, particularly in the Shewa and Wallo regions. Others maintained Islamic or indigenous beliefs, contributing to the religious diversity of the highlands. One of the long-term effects of the Oromo migrations was the fragmentation of imperial authority. The traditional balance between the central monarchy and regional nobles was disrupted. Oromo groups established their own local polities, often independent of imperial oversight, creating a patchwork of autonomous territories across what had once been unified regions. In some areas, imperial control persisted only in name, while real power was exercised by Oromo chiefs or military leaders. At the same time, the empire began to reflect the new demographic realities. By the 17th century, Oromo individuals had begun to rise in imperial service, joining the ranks of soldiers, administrators, and even court officials. Intermarriage with the Amhara nobility created new hybrid lineages, while the adoption of the Amharic language and Christian practices facilitated assimilation in some regions. Despite initial conflict, the Oromo became not only participants in the imperial system but, in many cases, its defenders and reformers. This period also witnessed the evolution of Oromo culture in response to new conditions. While the Gada system continued to function in many regions, it also adapted to the presence of state structures, religious institutions, and sedentary agriculture. Some Oromo groups maintained their pastoralist traditions, while others embraced farming and settled village life. Their diverse responses reflected the varied geography and political landscape of Ethiopia at the time. The cultural contributions of the Oromo began to emerge more visibly in the broader Ethiopian context. Oral poetry, music, and storytelling enriched local traditions. New forms of dress, cuisine, and social customs influenced the highland culture. Over time, the lines between Oromo and non-Oromo identities became increasingly blurred in many regions, particularly in areas of sustained interaction and integration. While the migrations created significant disruption, they also contributed to the dynamic and plural character of Ethiopia. The highlands, once dominated by a more narrowly defined Christian empire, became a space of greater ethnic and religious diversity. The imperial ideology would gradually shift to reflect this reality, even as later emperors sought to reassert central control and orthodox dominance. As the Ethiopian Empire entered the 17th century, it found itself in a period of both recovery and volatility. The trauma of recent wars, demographic changes brought by the Oromo migrations, and the lingering effects of weakened imperial control created a political environment in which religious unity and national identity were vulnerable to new pressures. It was during this delicate period that renewed contact with Europe, specifically with Catholic missionaries of the Jesuit order, introduced a profound theological and political crisis. What began as a diplomatic and religious overture from Rome would escalate into a conflict that challenged the very foundations of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and sparked a bitter civil war over faith, sovereignty, and tradition. The first sustained Jesuit presence in Ethiopia dated back to the late 16th century, when members of the Society of Jesus, an order founded during the Catholic Counter-Reformation, began to arrive in the highlands with the intention of bringing the Ethiopian Church into communion with the Roman Catholic Church. Their mission was guided by a combination of religious zeal and geopolitical ambition. For Catholic Europe, particularly the Iberian monarchies of Portugal and Spain, the reunification of all Christian churches under the Pope was both a spiritual goal and a means of strengthening influence in the Red Sea and Indian Ocean trade networks. Initially, the Jesuits were welcomed with a degree of curiosity and hospitality. Ethiopian emperors, intrigued by the outside world and aware of the growing influence of European powers, allowed Jesuit missionaries to operate within the kingdom, provided they respected local customs. Early figures, such as Father Pedro Paez, gained considerable favor at court. Paez, a Spanish Jesuit fluent in Ge'ez and Amharic, was a learned theologian and skilled diplomat. He won the trust of Emperor Susenyos and played a key role in introducing European technologies, architecture, and educational ideas to the Ethiopian court. Father Paez's approach was one of cautious dialogue and adaptation. He did not immediately challenge orthodox teachings, but instead engaged in theological debate and gradually presented Catholic interpretations of doctrine. His success in navigating the imperial court was unusual, and under his influence, Emperor Susenyos began to seriously consider the possibility of religious union with Rome. By the time of Paez's death, however, the situation had begun to shift. Emperor Susenyos, under the influence of more aggressive Jesuit figures who succeeded Paez, moved beyond theological curiosity and toward full conversion to Catholicism. In a dramatic and controversial decision, he publicly declared his acceptance of Roman Catholic doctrine and sought to make it the official religion of the empire. This decision, made in the year 1622, marked a radical break with the centuries-old Orthodox tradition that had underpinned Ethiopian identity since the time of King Ezana. The emperor's conversion did not occur in a vacuum. It was accompanied by a series of aggressive policies aimed at reshaping the religious life of the nation. Orthodox clergy were pressured to accept Catholic doctrine, including the papal supremacy and new liturgical practices. Churches were required to adopt Latin rituals, feast days, and theological positions, many of which contradicted long-standing Ethiopian interpretations. Resistance from both the clergy and the laity was immediate and intense. For many Ethiopians, these changes represented not religious reform, but cultural betrayal. The Orthodox Church was not merely a spiritual institution. It was a symbol of national continuity, a guardian of tradition, and a source of communal identity. The attempt to impose foreign doctrines from Rome was seen as a violation of sovereignty and a threat to the unity of the people. Revolts broke out across the highlands. Monasteries refused to cooperate, and popular uprisings challenged the emperor's authority. Emperor Susenyos, committed to the Catholic cause, responded with increasing repression. He issued edicts banning orthodox practices, imprisoned resistant clergy, and used military force to crush dissent. Battles between imperial forces and rebellious factions became more frequent, and the country was plunged into a period of civil unrest and religious violence. The crisis reached a breaking point when it became clear that the emperor's policies had alienated much of the population. While he had hoped to bring about unity under the Catholic Church, the result was widespread chaos and bloodshed. Recognizing the deepening crisis and the untenable position he had placed himself in, Susenyos eventually made the difficult decision to abdicate the throne. His son, Fasilides, ascended the throne in the early 1630s and immediately took decisive steps to restore peace and order. One of his first acts as emperor was to reverse his father's policies and restore the Ethiopian Orthodox Church as the official state religion. He expelled the Jesuits from Ethiopia, closed Catholic missions, and reaffirmed the traditional doctrines and rituals that had long defined the Church. Facilities' restoration of orthodoxy was greeted with widespread relief and celebration. He worked to rebuild trust between the monarchy and the clergy, re-establish monastic communities, and repair the damage done during the years of conflict. His reign marked a return to Ethiopian religious autonomy and the reaffirmation of cultural identity rooted in local tradition rather than foreign influence. At the same time, the legacy of the Jesuit mission left a lasting impact. Although their efforts ultimately failed, the Jesuits had introduced new ideas, technologies, and connections to the broader world. They had built schools, introduced European architectural styles, and fostered an interest in global geography and science. Yet their overreach served as a cautionary tale, reinforcing Ethiopian suspicion toward foreign religious involvement for generations to come. Emperor Fasilides also took steps to solidify Ethiopia's isolation from European powers. He closed off the kingdom to foreign missionaries and limited diplomatic engagement with Catholic Europe. While trade and communication with the outside world continued, particularly through Muslim intermediaries and the Red Sea ports, the Ethiopian state became more inward-looking in religious affairs. Following the intense religious conflict of the early 17th century and the expulsion of the Jesuits, Ethiopia entered a period of relative peace, centralized rule, and cultural flourishing. This new era is often referred to as the Gondarine Era, named after the city of Gondar, which became the political and cultural capital of the Ethiopian Empire. Spanning roughly from the mid-17th century to the latter half of the 18th century, this era marked a high point in courtly life, architecture, religious art, and the consolidation of imperial authority. The Gondarine Era began under the reign of Emperor Fasilides, the son of Susenyos, who assumed the throne after his father's abdication. Determined to restore religious harmony and strengthen the monarchy's legitimacy, Fasilides made a number of significant decisions that laid the foundation for the coming century. Chief among these was the construction of a permanent imperial capital, an innovation in Ethiopian political tradition. Prior to this time, Ethiopian emperors had governed through a system of itinerant courts. The royal camp, known as the katama, would move regularly across the empire. This mobility allowed the emperor to project authority over different regions but limited the development of permanent urban centers. Fasilides broke from this pattern by establishing Gondar in the northern highlands as a fixed seat of power. The choice of location was both practical and symbolic. Gondar was situated at a crossroads of trade and religious pilgrimage, nestled between fertile lands and protected by surrounding hills. It also occupied a central position in the Amhara heartland, reinforcing the cultural identity of the monarchy. With the founding of Gondar, Ethiopia witnessed a transformation in imperial architecture and urban planning. Fasilides and his successors constructed a royal enclosure known as the Fasil Gebi, a complex of palaces, banquet halls, churches, libraries, and administrative buildings surrounded by high stone walls and defensive towers. Drawing inspiration from both indigenous Ethiopian styles and foreign influences, especially Portuguese and Indian architecture, the buildings of Gondar featured domes, battlements, arched windows, and intricately carved wooden ceilings. The result was a unique architectural heritage, often referred to as the Gondarine style. The city quickly grew into a vibrant hub of political administration, religious ceremony, and artistic production. Court life was increasingly formalized. Nobles, church officials, diplomats, and foreign visitors gathered in Gondar, where they participated in public rituals, legal proceedings, and elaborate festivals. The coronation of emperors, the celebration of Christian holidays, and the staging of royal processions became grand events that reinforced the splendor and stability of the Solomonic Dynasty. Religiously, the Gondarine era saw a deepening of the Orthodox tradition. The emperors of this period were devout patrons of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. They sponsored the construction and renovation of dozens of churches and monasteries, many of which were adorned with wall paintings, icons, and manuscript collections. Some of the most renowned churches built during this time include Debre Berhan Selassie, famous for its ceiling decorated with rows of angelic faces and colorful biblical scenes. The development of religious art in Gondar was remarkable. Church walls were painted with vivid depictions of saints, prophets, apostles, and episodes from the Gospels. These murals served both devotional and educational purposes, offering visual narratives for congregations and reinforcing the spiritual messages of the liturgy. The style of painting was distinct, characterized by bold lines, bright colors, and expressive faces. While rooted in Ethiopian tradition, it also reflected subtle foreign influences, including Coptic, Byzantine, and even Indian motifs. In addition to visual art, manuscript production continued to flourish. Scribes and monks worked diligently in monasteries to copy religious texts, commentaries, hagiographies, and royal chronicles. These manuscripts, written in the Ge'ez language and often illuminated with miniature illustrations, were preserved in religious libraries and passed down through generations. Education remained closely tied to the church. Monastic schools trained clergy and scribes in theology, music, and ethics. The use of the Kain poetic form, a structured form of Ge'ez verse, became more refined, and scholarly debate on doctrinal matters continued. The Gondarine court also encouraged the composition of new hymns, prayers, and liturgical poems that enriched the religious life of the empire. Politically, the emperors of the Gondarine period worked to maintain a balance between central authority and regional autonomy. The empire remained a federation of provinces, each governed by appointed aras or dejazmach, who owed allegiance to the emperor. While some regions enjoyed a degree of independence, the capital's centralized administration helped coordinate tax collection, military campaigns, and legal decisions. Several emperors of this era distinguished themselves as effective rulers and cultural patrons. Emperor Iyasu the Great, who ruled in the late 17th century, is remembered for his military acumen, diplomatic skill, and support for religious institutions. He conducted campaigns to defend the empire's frontiers and attempted to mediate disputes between Christian and Muslim communities, especially in areas of mixed population under Iyasu and other Gondarine rulers. Ethiopia maintained relative peace and economic stability. The city of Gondar prospered from trade in livestock, grain, coffee, and artisanship markets flourished, and the presence of foreign traders, especially Armenians, Indians, and some Arabs, added to the cosmopolitan character of the city. While Ethiopia remained relatively isolated from Europe due to its caution toward Catholic missions, it was far from cut off from the wider world. Despite these achievements, the Gondarine era was not without challenges. Court intrigue, factional rivalries, and disputes over succession periodically disrupted the royal household. Powerful noble families vied for influence, sometimes manipulating or opposing the emperor. At times, weak monarchs were dominated by palace officials or regional warlords. Still, the institution of kingship remained intact, and the ceremonial grandeur of Gondar helped preserve the image of imperial continuity. Following the relative stability and cultural flourishing of the Gondarine era, the Ethiopian Empire entered a markedly different chapter in its long history, one defined by political fragmentation, diminished imperial authority, and the rise of powerful regional warlords. This period, known as the Zemene Mesafint, or Era of the Princes, spanned from the late 18th century to the mid-19th century. It was a time of decentralization, internal warfare, and courtly manipulation, during which emperors were reduced to symbolic figures while real power resided in the hands of provincial strongmen. The Zemene Mesafint was not inaugurated by a single event, but rather by a slow erosion of central authority that had begun in the later stages of the Gondarine era. As successive emperors struggled to maintain control over the expanding and diverse empire, ambitious regional leaders began to assert themselves more aggressively. These nobles, or Ras and Dejazmach, governed provinces like Tigray, Gojam, Begemder, and Shewa as semi-autonomous fiefdoms. While they still acknowledged the Solomonic emperor as a spiritual and symbolic leader, they effectively ruled their territories independently. The imperial court remained in Gondar, but its influence dwindled. Emperors were often appointed or deposed by dominant warlords, sometimes even forced to serve under house arrest within their own palaces. These monarchs retained their crowns, conducted ceremonies, and issued royal edicts, but only with the approval or at the command of those who held military and political control. In practice, Ethiopia became a federation of rival principalities, each governed by its own agenda and often at odds with the others. Among the most powerful figures of this era was Ras Mikhail Sehul of Tigray, a shrewd and ambitious warlord. Mikhail dominated the imperial court in the mid-18th century. He famously deposed Emperor Ayoas and replaced him with a more pliant ruler. His actions set a precedent. The emperor could be made or unmade at the will of a regional lord, signaling the effective end of centralized governance. Mikhail's rule also exposed the growing ethnic and regional tensions within the empire. The emperor he deposed, Ayoas, had favored Oromo officials and advisors, reflecting the increasing integration of Oromo elites into the court. Mikhail, representing the Tigrayan nobility, resented this shift in influence and acted to restore northern dominance. This event highlighted the delicate balance between the old Christian highland aristocracy and the newly incorporated populations of the south and west throughout the Zemene Mesafint. Ethiopia was plagued by near-constant warfare. Alliances were formed and broken with astonishing frequency. Armies clashed not only over land and tribute, but over personal ambition, local rivalries, and dynastic claims. Towns changed hands repeatedly. Trade routes were disrupted, and agricultural production suffered. Many regions were subjected to raids, plunder, and forced conscription, leaving ordinary people at the mercy of shifting warlord coalitions. Despite this turmoil, some aspects of Ethiopian life continued with remarkable resilience. The Orthodox Church remained a vital institution, providing spiritual guidance, education, and cultural continuity. Monasteries and churches, though often caught in the crossfire of regional conflicts, preserved sacred texts, maintained theological training, and offered refuge to displaced communities. The liturgy, music, and rituals of the church helped sustain a shared cultural identity during a time of political disunity. Gondar, while no longer the center of power, continued to be a city of religious significance and artistic expression. Royal churches still held festivals and ceremonies, and painters, scribes, and musicians continued their work. However, the grandeur of the earlier Gondarine court was fading, and the city increasingly reflected the decline of imperial authority. Economically, the empire was deeply affected by the instability. Trade, both internal and external, declined due to insecurity on roads and in markets. Craftsmen and merchants faced growing hardships, and famines occurred more frequently due to disrupted agriculture and war-induced displacement. The imperial treasury, once maintained through organized taxation, suffered as regional lords kept revenues for their own militias and courts. Yet, amid the fragmentation, seeds of future reunification were quietly taking root. In the southern region of Shewa, a local line of rulers began to consolidate power and restore administrative order. Descended from the Solomonic line, the Showan monarchs maintained a sense of legitimacy and began to reassert claims over surrounding territories. While the rest of the empire fractured, Shewa slowly grew stronger. One of the most notable figures in this regional resurgence was Selassie, who ruled Shewa in the early 19th century. He introduced administrative reforms, stabilized trade, and maintained a well-trained army. Though not yet emperor, his efforts laid the groundwork for the eventual reunification of the Ethiopian state. As the Zemene Mesafint wore on, Ethiopians grew weary of the constant conflict. The repeated power struggles and economic decline created a longing for order, unity, and national leadership. This desire would culminate in the emergence of a new leader, one who would rise from the crucible of war and usher in a new era of reform and centralization. After nearly a century of fragmentation, regional warfare, and the weakening of central authority during the Zemene Mesafint, or Era of the Princes, the Ethiopian Empire stood at a critical crossroads. Longing for stability and national unity, many Ethiopians looked for a strong leader who could bring an end to the chaos. That leader emerged in the form of Haile, a provincial nobleman and military commander who would later ascend to the imperial throne as Tewodros II. His reign marked a bold attempt to reunify and modernize Ethiopia, blending visionary reforms with autocratic rule and ending in dramatic confrontation with foreign powers. Kasa Haile was born in the early decades of the 19th century in the region of Kwara, in the northwestern part of the Ethiopian highlands. He came from relatively modest, noble origins, though he claimed Solomonic ancestry, a claim that would later support his bid for the throne. As a young man, Kasa gained a reputation for bravery, charisma, and military skill. Unlike many of the feuding nobles who had dominated the previous century, Kasa presented himself as a unifier, a man with a mission to restore Ethiopia's past glory. He began his rise through a series of successful military campaigns against rival lords and regional power holders. His forces defeated the armies of powerful warlords, seized key territories, and built alliances with local leaders who desired peace and central governance. Kasa's popularity grew among both the clergy and common people, who saw in him the promise of stability after generations of turmoil. In the year 1855, following a series of victories and after gaining control of Gondar and much of the northern highlands, Kasa Haile was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia under the regnal name Tewodros II. His coronation marked the symbolic end of the Zemene Mesafint and the reassertion of centralized monarchy. But Tewodros aimed to do more than simply restore imperial prestige. He envisioned a transformed Ethiopia, capable of standing alongside the modernizing powers of the world. From the beginning of his reign, Tewodros embarked on an ambitious agenda of reform. He sought to reduce the power of the nobility, centralize administration, modernize the military, and break the entrenched structures of regional rule. He implemented new tax policies designed to bring resources directly under imperial control and diminish the economic base of the provincial aristocracy. One of his most critical reforms focused on the military. Aware that the age of spears and swords was giving way to firearms and organized armies, Tewodros aimed to build a standing national army equipped with modern weapons and disciplined ranks. He established workshops to manufacture arms and munitions, and invited European craftsmen and advisors to assist in producing artillery. His desire for technological self-sufficiency was rooted in both patriotism and strategic necessity. He believed that only a modern military could defend Ethiopia from internal revolt and external threats. Tewodros also attempted to reform the legal system. He called for a more standardized application of justice and sought to limit the arbitrary power of regional judges and traditional authorities. He envisioned a state governed by codified laws and imperial decrees rather than by custom and regional favoritism. These efforts, while idealistic, often met with resistance from entrenched elites who saw their influence threatened. In religious affairs, Tewodros maintained support for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, but also demanded its cooperation with state-building goals. He expected clergy to contribute to national unity and did not hesitate to discipline those who sided with rebellious nobles or opposed his reforms. His efforts to assert control over the church were consistent with his broader philosophy of strong, centralized rule. Despite his vision and early successes, Tewodros II soon found himself facing growing opposition. His heavy-handed approach, especially toward the nobility and church, alienated many of the very forces he needed to maintain control. He became increasingly authoritarian, demanding absolute loyalty and punishing dissent harshly. Dissenting nobles were imprisoned, executed, or stripped of their titles. In some regions, uprisings broke out in response to his reforms and centralized rule. Tewodros's frustration with domestic resistance was compounded by diplomatic difficulties. Seeking international recognition and support, he wrote letters to European monarchs, including Queen Victoria of Great Britain, requesting skilled workers and military advisors. When his letters went unanswered or were met with bureaucratic delays, Tewodros interpreted this as an insult. He believed his rightful authority as a Christian emperor was being ignored by his supposed Western counterparts. In a dramatic turn of events, Tewodros arrested a group of British and European diplomats and missionaries in retaliation for the perceived slight. He held them at the mountain fortress of Magdala, demanding a response from the British crown. This act led to the famous British expedition to Abyssinia in the year 1868, a massive military operation mounted by the British Empire to rescue the captives and punish Tewodros. The expedition, led by General Robert Napier, was one of the most technologically advanced of its time. It involved tens of thousands of troops, engineers, and support staff, and was transported by sea to the Red Sea coast, then marched into the Ethiopian highlands. The invading army encountered little resistance along the way, as many local leaders, discontent with Tewodros's rule, chose not to support the emperor. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Magdala. Facing overwhelming odds and realizing that defeat was imminent, Tewodros refused to surrender. In a final act of defiance, he committed suicide rather than fall into enemy hands. His death marked the end of his bold, if turbulent, reign. In the aftermath of Emperor Tewodros II's dramatic fall at Magdala, Ethiopia faced a period of political uncertainty. The empire needed a leader who could restore national cohesion, continue the path of modernization, and, crucially, defend Ethiopian independence in an age when European colonial ambitions were rapidly consuming the African continent. That leader would emerge in the person of Menelik II, an astute ruler, skilled diplomat, and formidable military strategist whose reign would come to define modern Ethiopia. His most enduring legacy would be the astonishing defeat of an invading European power at the Battle of Adwa, a moment that resonated across Africa and the world. Menelik was born in the early 19th century in the region of Shewa, a powerful kingdom in central Ethiopia with a long-standing claim to Solomonic lineage. Though Menelik was captured and held for a time by Emperor Tewodros II, he eventually escaped and returned to Shewa, where he assumed leadership after the death of his father. From there, he began to build his own power base, carefully expanding his influence and consolidating control over key areas of the Ethiopian highlands. Following the brief reigns of Johannes IV and other regional contenders, Menelik emerged as the dominant figure in the empire by the late 19th century. In the year 1889, he was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia. His accession marked a new phase in the empire's development, one that would blend the traditional role of the Solomonic monarch with the urgent demands of a rapidly changing international environment. Menelik's reign was defined by three major priorities: expanding the empire's territorial reach, modernizing its infrastructure and institutions, and preserving its independence from European colonization. He pursued each of these goals with determination, often balancing diplomacy and warfare with remarkable precision. Territorially, Menelik embarked on one of the most significant expansions in Ethiopian history. With the support of his loyal generals and a growing army, he brought vast areas of southern, western, and eastern Ethiopia under imperial control. This expansion incorporated a number of diverse peoples and regions, transforming the Ethiopian state into a multi-ethnic empire stretching from the Red Sea coast to the borders of what are now Kenya and Sudan. While some of these conquests were marked by violence and resistance, they also brought previously autonomous or loosely affiliated areas into a more unified imperial structure. Administratively, Menelik introduced reforms aimed at strengthening state institutions. He developed a centralized bureaucracy, minted currency, and established diplomatic relations with foreign governments. Roads and telegraph lines were constructed to improve communication and logistics across the empire. European advisors and technicians were invited to assist with building infrastructure, training troops, and introducing modern education. Although Ethiopia remained largely agrarian, these reforms laid the foundation for a more integrated and modernized state. Menelik was also acutely aware of the threat posed by European imperialism. By the late 19th century, the so-called "scramble for Africa" was in full force, with major European powers carving up the continent into colonies and protectorates. While most African polities were being subdued or absorbed by European empires, Menelik sought to safeguard Ethiopia's independence through strategic diplomacy. One of the key episodes in this effort was the signing of the Treaty of Wuchale with Italy in the year 1889. The treaty was intended to establish formal diplomatic relations and clarify boundaries between Italian-controlled Eritrea and the Ethiopian Empire. However, a dispute arose over a key clause in the treaty. The Italian version claimed that Ethiopia had agreed to become an Italian protectorate, whereas the Amharic version made no such concession. When Menelik discovered the discrepancy, he immediately repudiated the treaty and began to prepare for the possibility of war. Italy, emboldened by its colonial ambitions and underestimating Ethiopia's military capacity, launched an invasion in the early 1890s. The goal was to force Ethiopia into submission and solidify Italian control over the Horn of Africa. What followed was one of the most remarkable and consequential military engagements in modern African history, the Battle of Adwa. Fought in March of the year 1896 near the town of Adwa in northern Ethiopia, the battle pitted Menelik's forces, composed of warriors from across the empire, against a modern, well-equipped Italian army. Estimates of the Ethiopian army's size vary, but it is widely believed that Menelik commanded over 100,000 troops, including infantry, cavalry, and artillery units. His wife, Empress Taitu Betul, played a vital role in mobilizing troops, supplying logistics, and leading forces from her native region. Menelik's strategy combined superior numbers, knowledge of the terrain, and strong leadership. His troops encircled and overwhelmed the Italian columns, inflicting a crushing defeat. Thousands of Italian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The victory at Adwa not only preserved Ethiopia's sovereignty, but also sent shockwaves throughout the colonial world. The Battle of Adwa was more than just a military success. It was a powerful symbol of African resistance to European domination. Ethiopia became the only African nation to successfully repel a European colonizing power during the height of the colonial era. The victory inspired anti-colonial movements across the continent and earned Ethiopia a place of honor in the international community. It demonstrated that an African state could, through unity, leadership, and strategy, stand as an equal to the imperial powers of the time. In the wake of the victory, Italy was forced to recognize Ethiopia's independence in the Treaty of Addis Ababa. European powers, including Britain, France, and Russia, quickly moved to establish formal diplomatic relations with Menelik's government. Ethiopia joined the community of nations not as a colonized territory, but as a sovereign state with the ability to shape its own destiny. Menelik continued to rule until his health declined in the early 20th century. During the later years of his reign, he focused on consolidating the gains made at Adwa and furthering modernization efforts. He founded the new capital city of Addis Ababa, which became the political and economic center of the empire. The city grew rapidly, attracting merchants, diplomats, artisans, and scholars from within Ethiopia and beyond. As the 20th century dawned, Ethiopia stood among the few African nations that had retained its sovereignty and imperial identity in the face of aggressive European colonization. The foundations laid by Emperor Menelik II, especially the victory at Adwa and the expansion of Ethiopian territory, positioned the empire for a new stage in its political and social evolution. Yet the world around Ethiopia was changing rapidly, and within its borders, the challenges of modernization, governance, and national integration remained pressing. Into this moment stepped a figure who would become one of the most iconic leaders of modern African history, Tafari Makonnen, later crowned as Emperor Haile Selassie, born in the late 19th century into a noble family from the region of Harar. Tafari Makonnen rose through Ethiopia's political ranks by demonstrating intelligence, diplomacy, and administrative skill. He served as governor of various provinces and earned the trust of Empress Zewditu, daughter of Menelik II. When Zewditu assumed the throne following a brief succession crisis after Menelik's death, Tafari was appointed as regent and heir apparent. During this period, He effectively wielded real power while the empress occupied a largely ceremonial role. Tafari's early years as regent were marked by efforts to introduce modernization within a deeply traditional imperial structure. He pushed for the development of modern education, supported new infrastructure projects, and encouraged engagement with the international community. In the year 1930, following the death of Empress Zuditu, Tafari Makonnen was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia and assumed the throne under the name Haile Selassie, meaning Power of the Trinity. The coronation of Haile Selassie was a grand affair, attended by foreign dignitaries, journalists, and observers from across Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. It marked Ethiopia's emergence as a recognized sovereign state in the global arena and affirmed the continuation of the Solomonic Dynasty in the modern world. From the outset, Haile Selassie envisioned his reign as one of transformation, anchored in Ethiopian tradition but oriented toward global engagement and progressive reform. Haile Selassie's domestic agenda focused on modernizing the Ethiopian state. He established a written constitution in 1931, the first of its kind in Ethiopia's history, defining the powers of the monarchy, outlining the structure of government, and introducing a parliamentary system. While the constitution still preserved imperial authority, it was a step toward institutional governance and legal reform. Education was another central pillar of Haile Selassie's rule. The emperor founded schools, promoted literacy, and created opportunities for Ethiopians to study abroad. He brought in teachers and advisors from Europe and the Middle East to help train a new generation of administrators, engineers, doctors, and scholars. The creation of ministries for education, public works, and justice reflected his commitment to building a modern bureaucracy capable of administering a diverse and rapidly changing country. Haile Selassie also worked to strengthen the Ethiopian military. Recognizing the threat posed by imperialist ambitions in the Horn of Africa, he sought to professionalize the army and acquire modern weapons. Officers were sent abroad for training, and military advisors were invited to Ethiopia to provide expertise. These efforts, however, would soon be put to the ultimate test. In the year 1935, the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini in Italy launched a full-scale invasion of Ethiopia. Seeking revenge for the humiliation of the Italian defeat at Adwa 4 decades earlier, and desiring to expand Italian colonial holdings in East Africa, Mussolini ordered his forces to invade from neighboring Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. The attack marked the beginning of the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. Ethiopia's resistance was fierce. Haile Selassie mobilized the imperial army and called upon the Ethiopian people to defend their sovereignty. Despite the bravery of Ethiopian troops and popular support for the emperor, the Italians possessed far superior military technology, including tanks, airplanes, and chemical weapons. The use of mustard gas and aerial bombardment by Italian forces shocked the world and inflicted horrific casualties on the Ethiopian population. Faced with overwhelming odds, Haile Selassie made a bold decision. He left Ethiopia and traveled to Europe, becoming the first head of state to address the League of Nations in person. Speaking in Geneva in 1936, he condemned the Italian invasion and called upon the international community to uphold justice and oppose aggression. His speech, delivered with dignity and moral conviction, became one of the most powerful moments in the history of international diplomacy. In his address, Haile Selassie warned that the attack on Ethiopia was not only an assault on one nation, but a test of the world's commitment to collective security and the rule of law. He famously declared, "It is us today. It will be you tomorrow." His appeal highlighted the failure of the League of Nations to prevent or respond effectively to fascist aggression, an early indication of the growing instability that would soon engulf the world in global war. Although the League's response was weak and ineffective, Haile Selassie's speech earned him international respect and recognition. During his years in exile, he continued to advocate for Ethiopia and build support among European and African communities. Meanwhile, within occupied Ethiopia, resistance movements organized and carried out guerrilla campaigns against the Italian forces. The tide began to turn during the Second World War in 1941. With the support of British and Commonwealth forces, Ethiopian patriots launched a coordinated campaign to liberate their country. Haile Selassie returned to Ethiopia that same year and was restored to the throne in triumph. His return was not merely symbolic, it marked the defeat of fascist occupation and the reassertion of Ethiopia's independence. Following the war, Haile Selassie became a prominent voice in the global movement for decolonization and African unity. He played a key role in the founding of the United Nations, where Ethiopia became one of the original member states. In the subsequent decades, he would emerge as a respected elder statesman on the world stage. Perhaps his most significant contribution to Pan-Africanism came in the year 1963, when he hosted the founding conference of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, in Addis Ababa. Leaders from across the continent gathered in Ethiopia's capital to chart a new course for African solidarity, independence, and cooperation. Haile Selassie, revered for having preserved Ethiopia's independence through centuries of struggle, served as a symbolic father figure for this new generation of African nations. Domestically, the post-war years were a time of continued reform, but also growing tension. While Haile Selassie expanded education, infrastructure, and diplomatic engagement, he faced criticism for the slow pace of land reform, the persistence of aristocratic privilege, and the limitations of political participation. Discontent simmered among students, workers, and sections of the military, particularly as poverty, inequality, and famine persisted in parts of the country. By the early 1970s, Ethiopia's challenges had multiplied. A devastating famine in the northern provinces claimed thousands of lives, and the emperor's government was widely criticized for its delayed response and lack of transparency. Protests erupted in the capital, and disillusionment spread among the younger generation. In 1974, a Marxist-inspired military committee, known as the Derg, seized power in a coup. Haile Selassie was deposed, ending over 3 millennia of monarchical rule in Ethiopia. He was placed under house arrest, and the monarchy was formally abolished. Though the precise details of his death in 1975 remain contested, it is widely believed that he died in custody at the hands of the new regime. By the early 1970s, Ethiopia stood at a historical crossroads. The empire, rooted in millennia of dynastic rule and shaped by the legacies of Aksum, the Solomonic Dynasty, and iconic emperors like Menelik II and Haile Selassie, faced mounting pressures from within and without. Decades of uneven development, widespread poverty, political exclusion, and a growing sense of alienation among the country's youth and military culminated in one of the most dramatic transformations in modern Ethiopian history, the Revolution of 1974 and the fall of the Ethiopian monarchy. The final years of Haile Selassie's rule were marked by a widening gap between tradition and change. While the emperor had earned international respect for his leadership on the world stage, domestically his government struggled to meet the demands of a rapidly changing society. The Ethiopian economy was still largely agrarian, with feudal landholding structures dominating the countryside. The vast majority of the population remained rural and impoverished, working under landowners who controlled much of the agricultural output. Efforts at land reform, while promised, were either slow or superficial. Meanwhile, a growing urban population, particularly students, teachers, and workers, became increasingly vocal in demanding social justice, land redistribution, and political participation. Universities and secondary schools turned into centers of dissent, where Marxist and anti-feudal ideas began to take root, inspired in part by revolutionary movements in Cuba, China, and the Soviet Union. A major catalyst for unrest came in the form of a devastating famine that struck the Wollo and Tigray provinces in the early 1970s. Tens of thousands of people died from starvation and disease. The imperial government was accused of gross mismanagement, negligence, and attempts to suppress information about the scale of the disaster. Foreign journalists exposed the famine to the world, severely damaging the emperor's image and fueling public anger at home. At the same time, within the military, dissatisfaction was rising. Many officers and enlisted men were poorly paid, lacked proper supplies, and resented the privileges enjoyed by the nobility and senior commanders. As the imperial government failed to respond effectively to growing unrest, a group of junior military officers and enlisted soldiers began to organize themselves into a revolutionary committee. This committee, eventually known as the Derg, meaning committee in Ge'ez, emerged as a powerful force in the capital. Initially formed to present grievances to the emperor, the Derg quickly evolved into a revolutionary body with its own political ambitions. Composed primarily of middle and lower-ranking officers, the Derg positioned itself as the voice of the people, demanding radical change, land reform, and the end of imperial privilege. By mid-1974, the situation in Ethiopia had reached a boiling point. Protests, strikes, and mutinies erupted across the country. Religious institutions, universities, and labor unions joined the call for reform. The Derg gained increasing support within the armed forces and among civilians frustrated by decades of repression and inequality. In September of that year, the Derg seized power and formally deposed Emperor Haile Selassie. The deposition of Haile Selassie marked the end of one of the world's longest continuous monarchical traditions. The emperor, who had ruled for nearly half a century and whose lineage traced back to the biblical union of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, was removed from the throne without a shot being fired in his defense. He was placed under house arrest in the Grand Palace in Addis Ababa. A year later, he died in custody under mysterious circumstances, with many believing he was quietly murdered by the new regime. Following the emperor's removal, the Derg declared the abolition of the monarchy and the end of the Ethiopian Empire. In its place, they announced the establishment of a socialist state. Land was nationalized, large estates were seized, and plans were set in motion for radical restructuring of society along Marxist-Leninist lines. The symbolic power of the monarchy was dismantled. The imperial crown and regalia were removed from public display. Statues of emperors were torn down, and references to the Solomonic Dynasty were erased from government institutions. What had once been the ideological cornerstone of Ethiopian unity, the sacred kingship believed to be divinely ordained, was now condemned as a relic of feudal oppression. Yet while the monarchy was abolished, its long shadow remained. The institutions built over centuries did not vanish overnight. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which had been intertwined with the monarchy since the 4th century, lost its official status but retained deep cultural and spiritual influence. The Derg attempted to suppress the church's power, imprisoning priests and restricting religious education, but it could not fully eliminate its role in Ethiopian life. The early years of Derg rule were marked by a mix of idealism and brutality. Initially popular for its promises of reform, the Derg soon resorted to authoritarian methods to maintain control, led by Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam. The regime launched the infamous Red Terror campaign in the late 1970s, targeting suspected political opponents, intellectuals, and anyone deemed disloyal to the revolutionary cause. Thousands were imprisoned, tortured, or executed without trial. The Derg's rule plunged Ethiopia into one of the darkest chapters in its modern history. Civil wars broke out in various regions, particularly in Eritrea, Tigray, and Oromia, as armed resistance to the regime intensified. The economy suffered under centralized planning, conflict, and recurring famines. While the monarchy had fallen in the name of progress, many Ethiopians now faced a new form of repression under a militarized socialist state. Internationally, Ethiopia aligned itself with the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, receiving military aid and ideological support. However, this alliance did not prevent internal collapse. By the late 1980s, the Derg's power had weakened considerably. In the early 1990s, a coalition of rebel movements, led by the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front and other groups, overthrew the regime and established a new federal government. With the fall of the Derg, Ethiopia entered a new political era. A federal system was introduced, emphasizing ethnic self-rule and regional autonomy. The monarchy was not restored, but nostalgia for the imperial past persisted among some segments of the population. Monarchical symbols, once banned, slowly reappeared in public life. Some descendants of the royal family returned from exile and began participating in cultural and charitable activities, though without political authority. The end of the Ethiopian Empire in 1974 brought to a close more than 3,000 years of dynastic rule, an unbroken line that, according to legend and belief, traced its origins to the ancient world. From the early kingdoms of Demt and Aksum, through the rise of the Zagwe and Solomonic dynasties, to the monumental reigns of emperors like Amda Seyon, Menelik II, and Haile Selassie, Ethiopia's monarchy had shaped the identity, faith, and resilience of its people. The revolution did not erase this legacy. Rather, it marked its transformation. While the imperial system no longer governs Ethiopia, its influence remains embedded in the country's institutions, culture, and historical memory. The castles of Gondar, the obelisks of Aksum, the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, and the royal chronicles that span centuries all stand as reminders of an extraordinary imperial heritage. As modern Ethiopia continues to navigate the challenges of governance, diversity, and development, the story of the empire remains a source of pride, reflection, and enduring fascination. The rise and fall of the Ethiopian Empire is not merely the history of a monarchy. It is the chronicle of a civilization that, across the centuries, preserved its identity against all odds and stood as a beacon of sovereignty and resilience on the African continent.